Well, hello. So glad we get to continue our study of the book of Ecclesiastes, continuing to draw the wisdom and application of the preacher into our lives. We're joined once more by Trey Haskett from Tupelo, Mississippi, and Greg Kline from Birmingham, Alabama. Been just a great study. I'm really appreciative of these guys' hard work, their zeal for the Lord. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. We are in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, which I think has a lot of good information for us and a lot of good application, particularly in a time where we're questioning the idea of authority and how do we relate to authority. And so we're going to go ahead and dive in. We're going to start with Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 1. And so the preacher says, "Who is like the wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a matter? A man's wisdom illumines him and causes his stern face to beam. I say, keep the command of the king because of the oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave him. Do not join in an evil matter, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since the word of the king is authoritative, who will say to him, 'What are you doing?' He who keeps a royal command experiences no trouble, for a wise heart knows the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every delight, though a man's trouble is heavy upon him. If no one knows what will happen, who can tell him when it will happen? No man has authority to restrain the wind with the wind, or authority over the day of death, and there is no discharge in the time of war, and evil will not deliver those who practice it. All this I have seen and applied my mind to every deed that has been done under the sun, wherein a man has exercised authority over another man to his hurt." And so the preacher has some, I think, really in-depth material for us here where he's discussing this idea of the royal command, of the king issuing commands to his people, and how the wise man reacts to those things. And so you almost get this idea of kind of the wise counselor of the king. How does he handle particularly a situation where he disagrees with the king? And I think this is always an important concept to address. How do we relate to authority, not in times where we agree with them? That's the easy thing. We're in agreement with them, so of course we're going to respect them. But how do we as Christians, in times where we disagree with figures of authority, whether it be government or whether it be church leadership or in a job situation, how do we react and interact with people in authority when we disagree with what they're doing? And I think the preacher gives us a lot of practical wisdom in this, where his advice is basically recognize the authority that they possess, recognize the kingship that this man possesses. And obviously, it's a little bit of a different situation between a monarchy and a lot of the situations we find ourselves in a modern day democracy. But there's still, I think, a very applicable point here that you need to recognize a man in authority. You need to recognize the position of authority. And I think he's making the point that, in essence, if your first reaction is to just blow up or to just leave the situation, part of his point, I think, is that you've kind of lost your ability to do anything. If your first reaction is to leave or to blow up and get frustrated, one, it's not going to change anything because the person's in the position of authority. And two, you've lost any ability to actually be a positive influence into the situation. And so, as he typically does, the preacher advises us, take a breath, take a moment, and wait for the proper time and procedure to explain these things, to discuss these things with somebody in authority. I think there's enormous applicability to that idea that we take the time to see, okay, when is the right time to bring this up? And that's not out of cowardice. It's not, I don't want to deal with this issue, so I'm just going to wait on it. But what is the appropriate time, the appropriate place to do these things? And you still do the matter, and Koheleth makes it clear, don't join an evil matter. Don't violate your conscience to do this. And so you don't just want to walk away from that situation because you're afraid to do the right thing. But in these types of situations, it is important to exhibit wisdom when dealing with authority. Trey, what do you see here in these first 9 verses?
Yeah, Andrew, I appreciate everything that you're saying here about how this relates to how we relate to our government, particularly in times that we may not agree with the decisions that are being made. And I think there's even an extra element to this, especially as we get into verse 9, where you see that this absolute rule, this authority of the monarch who has the power, at least in this life, over a life and death. You get in verse 9, he says, "All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt." And so the stakes are elevated here, even, it seems. Not only is there disagreement between the king and his advisor, but there is even the possibility of detriment to the one who is advising the king. And so what is the wise thing to do? Well, it's exactly what you were saying, that there's a time and a place to stand up and to speak up, and a way to go about doing that. But there's also a time when wisdom would dictate, under certain circumstances, to hold our peace. And I don't think that that is altogether cowardice, as you were saying, but I do think that is wisdom with the circumstances and the situations that we are in. And so maybe there's an elevation even here in these things. Greg, are you seeing anything different?
I just think that verse 5 really pops out. Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. Just this idea that there is a proper time and place, and that the just way needs to be followed. I think a lot of our problems come down to not a reaction, not a thought, but the application of that thought. Right? It's okay to need self-reflection, but self-reflection in the midst of 1,000 people might not be the right exact moment. Or maybe even correcting an opponent could be important, but not in the time and way that my emotional response might dictate. And so we really see from scriptures that there's not situational ethics in the sense that God's okay with lying here but not here, but there is a lot of realm of judgment that's needed. Jesus didn't yell at everybody. He didn't cry with everybody. He handled people in situations differently. Now, there's a lot of similarities because we have a lot of similarities as people. But ultimately, it comes down to, do we recognize what truly matters? And that is respect for authority, submission to authority, even when we're uncomfortable with it. That's clear in 1 Peter 2 and Romans 13. But also, even as we evangelistically shine our lights, really, how do we know what button to press and at what time? Well, 2 Timothy 2 says to correct our opponents with gentleness. So there is some correction to be done, but there's a proper place for it. And by the way, everything we disagree on doesn't need to be addressed at that moment. We would say we have to use discretion, discernment, or judgment for the proper time and the proper application. And really that matters because as man, we have limitations. We have flaws. We hear things not necessarily the way they're intended or the way they're meant. And we have other flaws that he points out here I think are powerful in the Ecclesiastes adventure here in verse 8. No man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. There's no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. If you look at this in verse 8, not only do we not get to decide when or if we die, we also can get ourselves quickly into conflicts that we can't get out of. It's very easy to get into a war. It's very easy to get into a conversation with someone where we show our disagreement and we're going to prove that we're right and they're wrong, or vice versa. It's very difficult to take things back. Right? It's been said that you can say something, but you can't necessarily take those words back. It's like if someone pops a pillow out in the driveway and the feathers go everywhere. Well, how to make up for gossip and slander? Go and track down every feather that flew away. It's not going to happen. We have to be careful with our words and with our plans and deeds first, and trust God's plan to be in our best interest. Use discretion and judgment to act out the best that we can to glorify God, and then trust him to do the rest. Verse 9, all this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. When those who are in power oppress those under them, everybody loses. God will judge the one in control, and the one who is being oppressed, God sees. But we need to make sure that we're doing our part. If you're in control, treat others with kindness, gentleness, and respect. And if you're being oppressed, know that God sees you. He is watching you, and he will have your back. It's a beautiful, wonderful thing to have a God who sees and cares. Let's go ahead and move on into this next section, 10 through the end of the chapter. Sounds like a lot. It's just 8 verses. And I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful. For this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. Andrew, you have experience with kids and not getting the right amount of sleep. What do you have to say about this section?
Yeah, I think pretty much every parent has had that experience of a sleepless night. I think it's really interesting here throughout this entire section. He's kind of picking up on that last verse in chapter or in verse 9, where he talks about this, exercising authority over his hurt. He comes back to this really consistent theme that he's talked about: the idea of injustice, the idea of things not seeming to work out on this earthly plane. And so he talks about these people that are, they're wicked and they're doing these things, and sometimes they don't get the justice that we think that they should receive. And sometimes he's talked about how the good don't seem to receive the righteousness that they should receive. And what's really interesting about this is that the preacher doesn't really answer the question. He doesn't really resolve the tension. He doesn't say, oh, well, here's the explanation for all this. He says, yeah, it's Hevel, it's vanity. It's frustrating that this occurs. It's this frustrating thing. And his solution is not, here's my answer for all of this. His answer, almost in spite of the evidence that he's seeing, almost in spite of the things that his eyes see, he says, I know that it will be well for those who fear God, who fear him openly. And again, the point is that, I don't necessarily see that. I don't necessarily see, the righteous always being rewarded or the unrighteous always being judged. He says, in fact, I see the opposite. And yet, because of my faith in God, I can say in verse 13, it will not be well for the evil man, and he will not lengthen his days like a shadow, because he does not fear God. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to what the preacher is saying, that he's ultimately saying, I don't have all the answers. I can't explain why all of this is occurring, why sometimes righteous men are afflicted and wicked men get away with their deeds. But he ultimately says the solution to this is not to try to puzzle this out, but to accept that you're not going to have the answer, to accept that you're not going to understand all of this. And that's why it might seem random, but it's a perfectly Ecclesiastes way of thinking. After saying that this too is futility, so I commend pleasure. But there's nothing good for a man under the sun except to eat and to drink and to be merry, and this will stand by him in the toils throughout the day of his life, which God's given him. He's basically saying you're not going to have all the answers. You're not going to be able to understand these tensions within life, these difficulties within, justice and oppression and righteousness. So don't try to answer them. Trust that God is going to answer these things. Trust that God is going to be righteous because he's given us every piece of evidence that he is. Fear God and go live your life and go do what you know to be wise and just, even if the world may not seem to operate on those principles sometimes. And I think there's an enormous wisdom to Ecclesiastes of this sense of basically the answer is you don't know the answers. So humbly accept you don't have all the answers and go live your life like you should. Trey, what do you see here in these 10 through 17?
Yeah, I think the ability to say that we don't know is really needed. And to recognize that we do come up short when we're trying to grasp the grand scheme of what God is doing in this world. We can't get it all. And yet, as we've said before, the preacher comes back and he does say that there are some things that he can know. And so there's an interesting contrast there in verses 10 through 13, where we've been given sort of these incongruencies, these contradictions, even in the preacher's own speech, things that he has said that really don't quite line up with one another. And we see that here, 11 and 12 especially. He's talking about how he sees the wicked and they die and they've got these funerals and everybody remembers them in a certain light, in a certain way. But really, these people were pretty wicked. They were evil, and nobody cares about that. Nobody remembers the terrible things that they did. And so justice, even in death, it doesn't seem that justice is being executed. It doesn't seem that it's being brought forth. And yet, he speaks about the fact that these wicked men, they prolong their days into verse, or beginning of verse 12, rather. The sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life. And so this is what he observes, this is what he sees. But then there's a transition in the middle of verse 12, and it says, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. And so which is it? Does he prolong his life? Does he prolong his days, or does he not? And I think what we're seeing here is a little bit of a glimpse behind the curtain, if you will, in the preacher's struggle as he has been approaching life through this under the sun, secular, this world, what I can observe, what I can see, this sort of observational epistemology is everything looks meaningless and it looks like there's no justice. And yet what I know in my heart of hearts, what I know in my confession of faith is that God ultimately is just and there will be a judgment and that it will be better for those who fear God and those who follow him. And so as we look at death and we think about death as this great equalizer and it leaves us in this enigma, it leaves us with this hevel state of mind, we've got to realize that at the end of the day, God is going to judge, and so it will truly be better for those who do fear him. And I think, again, we're getting some of the glimpse behind the curtain here and ultimately where the preacher is going to end and where the narrator will end at the end of this book. Greg, do you have anything to add?
So verse 12 really has the answer here. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God because they fear before him. What the author here is really trying to get across is this struggle between looking down and looking up. Paul in the New Testament is going to illustrate in Colossians 3, we have to set our minds on things above. Going back to the first chapter, there was this problem with mankind. The eye cannot be satisfied, nor can the ear be filled. And that is, as long as we look to this world for answers, for equity, for fairness and justice, there's never going to be peace. There's never going to be understanding. There's never going to be ultimate joy. And yet there is joy in something. In verse 12, it's fearing God. And notice also in verse 15, and I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. And while ignorance is bliss has either gotten too good a press or too bad a press, if we kind of split the gap a little bit and say, we don't bury our head in the sand towards tough ideas. We have to take stands. We have to believe in God no matter what that means. And fearing God means standing up for a lot of battles, to stand for what's right and what's just. But at the same time, if we stop looking around and fixating on what we don't have or what we don't know, and be thankful to God for what he has blessed us with, and live out our life using what he's given to help others and to serve him, it's going to all come together in a way that there is no other peace otherwise. Unless or until we acknowledge that, as has been spoken of, that A, we do not have all the answers and can't get them. B, away from God in this life, there is going to be all kinds of inequity and unfairness. And C, that the righteous may not prosper well in this life. As long as we hold on to those three ideals, we're going to be stuck. But if we can give them up, if we can set our mind on things above, we know God is there and we can have that peace that surpasses understanding. Andrew, I think this section is strong, but even the whole chapter has a lot of good application for us. What do you think stands out to you really as a takeaway here?
Yeah, I think the big thing that to me stands out, and you're going to see it really in these last two verses of 16 and 17, is that, he makes a statement, I gave my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done on the earth, even though one should never sleep day or night. And I saw every work of God, and I concluded that man cannot discover the work which has been done under the sun. And you almost want to kind of throw your hands up and be like, well, isn't that the whole point of the book? Like, this is wisdom literature. Aren't you supposed to tell me what's wisdom and what the answers are? And isn't that what we're seeking? And that's a lot of times, I think, the perspective that we come to the wisdom literature with is, okay, here's X situation, give me the solution to X situations that I can get to Y state. And the wisdom literature isn't that clean cut. It doesn't have those answers because Ecclesiastes in particular lets us know that life is messy, that life is very hard to fit into these comfortable preconceived boxes that we often bring to the table. And so it's not going to happen that way. And so part of wisdom, a huge part of wisdom, is understanding that life is complex, that life is enigmatic, that it is this havel, it is this vapor that is hard to grasp and hard to understand. And so knowing that, having that confidence, having that understanding, what that does is that really frees us from the burdens of existence and the frustrations of trying to figure this out, to go be wise, to go be fruitful people, to go be people who work hard and do these things, because we have not tried to burden ourselves with understanding all of the intricacies of life, but instead having this simple statement of trust that God is in control. We may serve rulers, like in the first 10 verses, that are not just, that are not exercising authority in a proper way. Yet we can have trust that there is a ruler, there is a king who is exercising this authority. And he's exercising authority in ways we might not understand. We might not be able to see from our limited perspective how all of this works together. And Ecclesiastes says that's okay. You're never going to do that. So stop worrying about that and instead focus on the little bit of your life that you can control, which is your attitude, your actions, and how you respond to the difficulties of life. And so I think that's really one of the biggest takeaways of this chapter, and really the whole book, is what wisdom actually is. It's not having all the answers to everything, but being content with the few answers that we do have. Trey, what do you see as far as application goes?
Yeah, I want to draw our minds to 16 and 17 as well. When we think about sleepless nights, and you know, I know at least for myself, last night I did not get to bed until like 5 this morning. I was up with one of our kids, and as you mentioned, anybody who's a parent knows that. But I imagine if you're a parent of older kids, you know that for a different reason, right? And it's because you have been up worrying about what your kids are, maybe what they're struggling with, what they're going through. Maybe your kids are off to college, and there's a lot that you're uncertain about, and the situations that they're facing, and there's just so much to worry about and so much that we can't know. And I think maybe that gets us a little bit closer here to the preacher's struggle and his lack of sleep. It's not just that he's got insomnia and he can't get to bed. It's that he is wrestling with some really deep and heavy things that he doesn't have answers for and that he can't quite figure out. And so that's keeping him up at night. And Andrew, you mentioned freedom, and I think that's a big part of what wisdom gives us, is this freedom to know I can't know everything. I don't know everything. And it allows us to unburden ourselves of these great fears and these great worries. And you know, we think about the injustice in this world, and we look at the wicked, and it seems like everything is going right for them, and they're not getting any recompense. Justice is not being carried out. And these are the types of things that can keep us up at night. But as you mentioned, the wisdom to trust God, the wisdom to say, I know that God is a just God, and regardless of what I'm seeing here in my earthly existence, there's something bigger going on behind the scenes. And even though I don't have all the answers, I can't fit all the pieces of the puzzle there, I can trust him. And then I can have rest, then I can have peace, then I can have sleep, as it were. And so I know it kind of sounds trite, but maybe let's stop worrying. Let's stop trying to understand and figure out all the things that life is throwing at us, because at the end of the day, we're not going to have the answers. And I know we've said that a lot as we've gone throughout the study, but I think that's part of the push of this book, is to get us to realize we can't see everything going on, but we know that God does, and so we trust in him. Greg, any last thoughts or applications?
I think just in addition to that well-said piece on we're not going to have all the answers, is that because we don't have all the answers, we have to do the best we can with what we have. And verse 5 again, whoever keeps the command will know no evil thing. And the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way, for there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on it. There's trouble in this life. There's problems, there's sufferings, there's persecutions, there's that which is unfair. But ultimately, if we do trust in God, if we do accept that we're not in control, that God is in control, and that even in this life where we all have free will, we can make good choices and bad choices that absolutely affect one another, that if I take all that to heart, I realize that leaves me with one job. As we're going to see in chapter 12, fear God and keep his commandments. Or in the case of verse 5, keep the commandments and know no evil thing. Just do my part. Don't worry about everybody else. Don't worry about everything else. Do my part. Now, my part includes serving others. So it doesn't mean that I don't care about them. It means that inequities and injustices I speak up for from a biblical perspective, but also I realize that I can't stop them. I can't out-legislate. I can't make somebody be perfect by bashing them on the head with the Bible, as fun as that may sound. It ultimately comes down to, do I have a good relationship with God, and do others? And if they don't, let's show them how great God is. That all this inequity that's around doesn't have to ultimately bother you, because you know you're going to a place where that's not an issue, because God is perfect, he is perfectly just, and he's perfectly righteous. That's who we live for, that's who we fear, and that's where true joy and peace is found. That's the only way. Ecclesiastes chapter 8 is another example of giving us some great wisdom spiritually, but also how to get through this life with all of its pitfalls. Andrew, thanks again for letting us join you, and I appreciated this study today.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate you guys being with us. We're going to get a chance next time to talk about Ecclesiastes chapter 9, which is really going to kind of expand this discussion we see taking place at the end of the chapter. And so we're going to get to continue to talk about that, again, some really good considerations of wisdom and what that actually means for us in a practical way. So thank you so much for tuning in. We hope to see you next time. God bless, and we'll see you again.